Thank you, everybody. Again, my name's Kurt Thomas. I'm a research scientist at Google. And today, I really want to talk about rethinking what we mean by security when it comes to online hate and harassment. And the reason I'm interested in this research area is that emerging threats like hate and harassment really are transforming the day-to-day abuse experiences that people face on the internet. Before, I would talk to you about spam, phishing, and malware, but now there's a rash of new types of attacks that are occurring. These are threats like the non-consensual leaking of intimate images, say by an intimate partner or another person that's anonymous online. This happened to former Representative Katie Hill, who previously was in Congress and then had intimate images leaked, allegedly by a former partner, that led to her stepping down from her role and ultimately severe mental health and well-being consequences for her. There are also attacks like coordinated campaigns of toxic comments on social media that attempt to silence voices. For Leslie Jones, when she released Ghostbusters, there was a wave of racist and other messages that occurred against her on social media that ultimately led her stepping back from the platforms and participating online. There's also cases of people being falsely reported to authorities or platforms to either take action against their person or their accounts. For Nate Hill, while he was live streaming on Twitch, he had the SWAT team called to his home and cut off his stream while that was happening. But it doesn't have to be a SWAT team. It can be a copyright claim made against your content or a false claim that you're abusing a platform to try to remove your voice from online. And there's also cases of surveilling intimate partners through their devices or through their accounts. For many people, this could be in the form of keystroke monitoring on their phones. It could be hidden cameras. It could be GPS tracking, basically weaponizing technology in an intimate partner violence setting. And the common thread that connects all these different threats together is that there's an intent to inflict emotional harm, including coercive control or instilling a fear of sexual or physical violence. And I think it's important to note that it's not just high-profile targets that are being affected by these attacks. In 2017, Pew did a survey, and they found that 41% of people in the United States have personally experienced online hate and harassment. And the same is true for about 40% of people globally. And this hasn't escaped the attention of many internet users. If you ask people what are their top concerns of participating online and what they feel technology or policy or law enforcement should be addressing, yes, identity theft and stolen information still ranks very highly amongst their concerns. But harassment and bullying is up there in the top 3 of what they care about. And there's increasing energy from these users to say that platforms and other individuals should be stepping in to help them. The problem is that a lot of the existing protections that we have in this context really focus on for-profit cybercrime. We've made immense strides in warning people about spam, phishing, and malware, and getting them not to go to dangerous websites. We've warned them against data breaches and password reuse and behaviors that put them at risk of having their accounts taken over. And of course, bots and automation. But none of these map onto the security and privacy needs in a hate and harassment context. And so really the thesis of this talk today and what I hope to motivate you about is that we need to expand our security threat models to address these attacks that lack the same scale or profit incentives of the way we currently think about security and privacy. To that end, one of the things that our research team has been working on is really building a framework to reason about what are hate and harassment attacks right now? Who are the attackers and what are the harms that result from it? As part of this, we teamed up with 6 different academic institutions across the United States as well as Europe to do this meta-analysis of about 150 articles that commented on, here's an attack that happened to me, or here's a deep dive into different things that are going online or across the internet. And what we found is that there's a variety of types of attackers when it comes to hate and harassment. It could be a spouse, it could be a family member, it could be a peer, which fundamentally changes our assumptions about security. These are people who have access to your device, access to your accounts, and even access to your physical person. Of course, there are anonymous internet users, but there's also attackers who are public personalities or even coordinated mobs, where there's a huge power differential between the attackers and their capabilities and the individual that's being targeted for attack. We're also seeing a variety of different types of harms that are different from what we think about in traditional, say, for-profit cybercrime. The goal isn't to make money off an individual. The goal here is to silence their voice. It's to damage their reputation. It's to reduce their sexual or physical safety, or even reduce their financial security or ability to kind of operate independently. And the list of harms goes on, but these are very different from the types of things we normally talk about when we say a computer system being broken into. What we found is that in analyzing all these different attacks that people have been experiencing, there's roughly 7 categories. And I'm not going to go into all of them today, but we came up with as a framework to reason about what differentiates them. So let's take toxic content as an example. This includes things like bullying, trolling, hate speech, threats of violence, sexual harassment. And what connects all these together is that there's an intent to be seen by the individual being targeted, as well as often intent to be seen by a wider audience. And all it requires is a communication channel, a messaging app, a social media connection in which to interact with that individual. And ultimately, the intent here is to silence them or damage their reputation in most cases. Contrast that with something like surveillance, where we're talking about somebody who's stalking you or geo-tracking your activities or monitoring your accounts. It's fundamentally different in the sense that they don't want to be seen. There's no audience involved here. There's no communication channel that's necessary for this. Fundamentally, what underpins all of these attacks is a requirement for access to privileged information about the user or their devices. And again, the intent for harm is different here. It's usually about coercion, reducing sexual or physical safety, rather than necessarily trying to silence them online. And there's a variety of other attacks that we go over in our framework. It is available online, and I'll link it to it in the end of the talk. The other interesting thing in kind of analyzing all these different hate and harassment scenarios is that there's actually many parallels that we can draw to existing attacks that many of us deal with in this room. For toxic content, it's very similar to spam. Thousands of messages being sent to you that you don't want to receive, whether it's about pharmaceutical products or about how you shouldn't belong on the internet, is a vague differential. Also for things like impersonation, it's very similar to the threats we face with phishing and representation of what an identity looks like online. Or for surveillance, we see even tools like remote access Trojans, which historically come from, say, banking malware context where you're trying to steal somebody's money, is now being used in a surveillance context in an intimate partner violence scenario. And so there's lessons that we can take so that we don't have to start from ground zero in addressing many of these threats. So in coming up with this taxonomy, what we found is that really addressing each class of hate and harassment is going to require some unique combination of warnings, nudges, moderation, automated detection, or even just conscious design. Because how we're going to go about and solve something like toxic content is going to be fundamentally different from how we go about thinking about surveillance or impersonation or intimate content leaking online. And so we need to understand the nuances of each of those threats and their capabilities before we think about the solution space. Another thing we've been working on our research team is understanding the prevalence of online hate and harassment and who's uniquely at risk of attack right now. As part of this, we've been measuring the prevalence of harassment globally for many years now in 22 different countries across 50,000 different participants in different countries around the world in different interstitials of time. And what we found is that hate and harassment really is a global phenomenon. In Kenya, it affects as many as 72% of people that are participating online, and in Japan, it's about 20% of individuals. And the United States is somewhere in between at about 36% of people. What we also find is that these country granularities matter. The threats in, say, Brazil, people often talk about sexual harassment as being one of their top concerns, whereas in the United States, it's concerns around stalking. And every other country has different variations. But if we take it as a global perspective, just averaging everything together, we find that the topmost concerns very often are about toxic content. Many people are experiencing being insulted and treated unkindly, having someone make hateful comments about them, being called offensive names. And this counts for about 14 to 19% of people around the world. But we also see a variety of more severe but less prevalent threats, things like being stalked, having your account hacked by somebody that you know, having someone purposefully leak photos about you to embarrass you, or having someone use spyware to monitor your activities. This affects people, on the order of 4 to 7% of individuals around the globe. And so I think when we talk about how do we prioritize which threats we should be looking at, you have to think about a dual spectrum here. There's a prevalence component, which would say toxic content is the biggest problem, but there's also a severity component for how impactful these harms are to the end users, in which case things like stalking and account hijacking may take higher prevalence or importance. The other challenge here is that in measuring this year over year, we're seeing that hate and harassment really is an increasing problem. So in 2016, when we first started doing these measurements, if we looked 1 year later, the odds of experiencing hate and harassment had increased by 1.2 times. And again, if we looked in 2018, it increased by 1.3 times. And this is a growing and unabated problem. It means that the solutions that we have right now aren't addressing the problem, and more people are experiencing this type of abuse online. But this abuse is disproportionately felt by certain populations. So if we were to model the likelihood that you personally experience hate and harassment online while controlling for different variables like where you live, how often you use social media, your gender, and other demographic attributes about you, we come up with different modeling components. So an interesting thing is men and women actually face similar levels of hate and harassment online, but their experiences are fundamentally different. Men often face threats of violence and physical threats and name-calling, whereas women are far more often facing threats related to sexual harassment and stalking. But for the LGBTQ+ community, they face 2 times the rate of online hate and harassment compared to other counterparts. And the same is also true for very young people who identify as 18 to 24 years of age. They face 4 times the rate of hate and harassment online than older counterparts. And again, for people who use social media on a daily basis, they face 2.5 times the rate of hate and harassment. And so from all this modeling, the important thing to understand is that we really need, when considering solutions for hate and harassment, to design for the experiences and threats faced by these at-risk populations, not just the mythical average user. Because in many cases, these individuals are at the forefront of the threats that are occurring online. And by learning from them, there's actually downstream benefits that we can provide to the broader population by learning from them, building more robust protections, and scaling that to everybody. The last point I want to make today is that there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to hate and harassment attacks. And I want to talk about toxic content as a way to illustrate this point. Right now, there's a variety of tools and technologies that are being developed to potentially automatically classify and detect hate and harassment that occurs via messages and comments and things like that. Google has an offering called Perspective that rates a comment on a rating of 0 to 1 on how likely it's going to kind of degrade the discourse of that conversation. Instagram has also launched a feature recently where if you're about ready to post a comment to an image, they will warn you whether it's similar to content that's been reported in the past as hate and harassment. And IBM and others have kind of started to develop classifiers along this line. But a fundamental problem underpinning all these different solutions is that what constitutes toxic content is highly subjective, and it's going to vary from one individual to another based on their personal experience. To kind of illustrate this point, we did a survey where we asked a number of people a simple question, which was, how toxic do you personally find this comment? We showed them a different set of comments drawn from Twitter, Reddit, 4chan, with a sliding scale of what we interpreted as very likely to be toxic to this should be innocuous. And we gave them a scale to rate themselves that said, I think this is not at all toxic to it's extremely toxic. And we ran this in the United States only across 20,000 different participants. And we showed them 100,000 different comments that were randomly sampled. But we made sure to select a pool of participants with diverse backgrounds. So people that were minorities, people that were LGBTQ+, people who were religious, people who were parents, all to understand how these various factors might inform how them reading a comment online, their belief that, yes, you should be able to post this. Yes, I'm comfortable being able to see this. And what we found is that the chance of you rating content as toxic is highly dependent on these different demographic factors. So if you're a young individual who's 18 to 24, you're 1.3 times more likely to see a random comment and say, I think that's toxic and I don't want to see it and I don't think that should be able to be posted online, compared to older individuals. And we saw the same thing was true for minorities, for the LGBTQ+, and for parents. So all of these people are approaching content that's appearing online through the lens of, maybe what do I want my kids to see? What is my community experiencing right now that other people might not be aware of? But a really fascinating component to this is also people who have personally experienced toxic content and hate and harassment are 1.4 times more likely to say, this comment that you've randomly drawn from the internet is toxic and I don't think it should be posted. And what this means is that they're internalizing their own experience and interpreting what's being posted through that lens for what type of speech they feel should or shouldn't be allowed online. So as technology platforms, policymakers, and lawmakers, this poses a significant challenge. Really what we need is to enable personalization or community-level protections to help us overcome this ambiguity that can't be tackled by platform-wide bright lines. And this isn't to say there isn't such a thing as hate speech where platforms really should draw a line and say there is no context in which this should be allowed to be posted, but that in the long tail of the internet and speech, everybody is going to approach this with different opinions. And so what we need is really to think about different spheres of enforcement. What is it that's acceptable for me to decide what I want to see or not to see? How do you empower communities to make moderation decisions on other people's behalf so that not everybody has to read every noxious comment on the internet to make a determination of what they do or don't want to see? And likewise, what are the decisions that we can say, as a platform, we're ready to make this call, or as a society, we're ready to make this call of what content should or shouldn't be allowed? So to wrap up, the things that I want you to take away from this talk is really that as hate and harassment transforms the threats that people experience, we as a security community need to adapt and meet these challenges head on. This is not a sociology problem. It is not a problem for another conference. These are technical means that are being used to affect end users, and we have and the onus is on us to step in as security and privacy experts to help and address it. So to that end, what we've provided so far is, one, a framework for reasoning about what these threats are, the harms, and the types of protections and solutions that might work for each of the individual contexts. Because again, how we solve toxic content is going to be fundamentally different from how we think about surveillance or overloading people with SMS bombs or falsely reporting them for copyright strikes. We've also provided metrics on the prevalence of the types of abuse that people are experiencing right now, as well as identified at-risk populations that we really need to prioritize protections for, and can also use for understanding what works for them and scale that out to the broader population. And lastly, because of all the nuance that's here, as many people have already brought up as we talked about content moderation earlier, there's a need for customization here to empower individuals and communities around the world to react to the threats that they're facing. And I don't want to paint this as it's on the user to solve this problem. It's to say that that is one lever amongst many with policymakers and others to try to address this problem. I'm a technologist, so that's where I focus my energy right now. If you want to learn more, we've actually been doing a lot of research in this space. The 2 papers listed at the top are ones that I talked about today. We've also done research in South Asia, really to understand the context of how does hate and harassment differ from country to country, and how do the design solutions that we adopt need to meet the needs of those individuals in those regions. And we also have some research coming up at CHI at the end of the year, specifically talking to another at-risk populations, which is creators online, people who are at the forefront of experiencing hate and harassment due to their prominence and their visibility. So with that, a shout out to many collaborators, both at Google and abroad, who helped on this research, and thank you all for listening.